right, everything's good. Thank you guys for coming out to join us. I'm super excited to be here. Hoping that we can get some good information out and then towards the end get a little bit of chance for you guys to ask some questions. I'm pretty informal, so feel free to raise your hand, things like that. We don't have a lot of time, but I definitely want to make sure you guys get your worth. All right, hacking the funding structure. All right, I don't know if you all know this, but 75% of startups fail. And that's just a general statistic, but it's important to note because it tells you how hard it is in general to start a company, let alone if you are an underrepresented group or a disadvantaged group or an emerging market like Detroit is. Why do those startups fail? It's kind of important. One of the key things is there's a whole bunch of reasons. It could be that the team doesn't get along. It could be that they don't have good investors. It could be that they don't know their business model. It could be they don't have enough resources in their community. It could be that their team chose the wrong product or that their product just was ahead or behind the market. There's a lot of different reasons why startups typically fail. But across the board, almost all of them have something to do with funding. There's some issue with funding that is causing or impacting the ability for that company to scale. So important for us to note is that although funding impacts all of these, funding is not the core reason why companies don't fail. Because you're supposed to be a business owner first. Getting the investment is just a tool, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Within all of that, here's the important part that has been a passion project of mine and something that I've been working on for several years. Under 2% of founders who are women or people of color receive venture capital investment. And this is with last year's notes of having $85 billion worth of funding out there. Those groups are receiving less than 2%. And a lot of that has to do with a couple of key reasons. They don't have pipeline access, they don't have education access, and they don't have access in general. So the key there is trying to figure out, like, how can we make sure that we're getting over these hurdles for entrepreneurs of color, female founders, and people of the LGBTQ community. So who am I? My name is Monica Weed, as she mentioned. I've been doing this work for a little bit over 20 years. I built products and scaled products for Fortune 500 companies, the first part of my career. Then I built and scaled products for myself. And I spent the last 10 years or so scaling products and helping entrepreneurs and other companies scale products, and a lot of them involved either getting investment, pursuing investment, or other types of funding, and we'll chat about that too. There's three parts to where I find my funding knowledge came from. The first part is what I call the ad ones, gentle giants. These are companies that are Fortune 10, most of them, but definitely Fortune 500 that we've worked with and on and in partnership with, including Catalys, including Google, including Mustang, including the Escalade, all these different large-scale entities that had products that they were trying to sell and really large budgets that they were doing it with, sometimes upwards over $1 billion. So these people are getting their funding from a variety of ways. Some of it is revenue, some of it is grants, some of it is investment. The second one is a definite passion point of mine. I'm really focused into the community of teaching people how to do this, teaching young folks how to code, and then teaching adults who maybe never been exposed before, teaching them how to get access for themselves and how to code and understand computer science, tech, and digital entrepreneurship. Within that space, again, they are getting investment, they are getting grants, they are getting loans, they are getting government programs that are upwards of $9.7 billion across a lot of different entities. And the third part I call the mad ones. This is where I play mostly now. This is the focus of venture capital and accelerators. This is the focus of corporate innovation. This is the groups that are sitting here focused on helping the people in disadvantaged markets get a chance to be a part of the larger thing that you see on television, on the internet about starting companies. And these guys, anywhere on a typical year, not even all through their entire life cycle, in a typical year and sometimes a typical month can go up towards to $3 billion. And again, that's a variety of funding. It's not just investments, but a lot of it is largely investments, but it could be grants. There are competitions, there are loans, there are different ways. All right, so before we dip in a little bit, I want you guys to remember these three numbers for the end. The number 1, the number 10, and the number 30,000. So we're going to talk a lot about numbers in this presentation, but we're really not going to talk about the math side. We're talking about how do you use those to your advantage. Funding. All right. So how many of you have ever pursued funding before? Tried, heard about it, thought about it, wanted to do it? I see a few hands. All right. Funding is not a sequential path. Super, super important to note that. That's the biggest thing that most folks don't know, especially if this is not a common part of your dinner table. This is not what people in your families do. You don't know that it's not a sequential path. What everybody does part A, everybody does part B, then everybody does part C. It doesn't work like that. So the first thing to realize is that the path can start anywhere from the beginning all the way to the end, and it can jump around. People might start in the middle and go backwards. They might start in the middle and go forwards. They might only do 2 steps. There's no guarantee that you have to follow all of these steps. But this could be a path of different ways that people would start out with a business idea and get it funded, and then eventually gain investment for it, and then eventually either exit the business or continue to run it in the long term. A lot of people start at bootstrapping. Bootstrapping is just using your own money to start up the business. Then you can do competitions and get grants. That's free money. It's not really a lot of investment in that level. It's really getting the money that you've applied for and competing against other folks to get it. In the middle is more of the investment phases. You can do crowd-funded investments, you can do Kickstarters, you can do actual angel investments, you can do actual venture capital investments. And then towards the end, you start thinking, what am I gonna do next? Some people wanna run their business until they retire. Other folks want to get their business to the highest value and then exit. So it's a combination of trying to figure out where you want to go, what your goal is. That's going to dictate how your funding path is going to go. And it's not going to be sequential. So the first thing you need to know, you need to speak the language, you need to know the rules. So the first hack is pretty simple. Learn the language, learn the rules, and then break them. It's really important. I think the biggest thing that I see with entrepreneurs, especially in emerging markets and especially in underrepresented groups, is that part of it is that they don't know what they don't know, but the other part of it is that they hear a few things and they never really investigate further and they never really go deeper, and then they're trading on inaccurate information. So some easy ways to get started in learning the language: you can do it in your own home. You don't have to ask questions. You don't have to worry about people thinking about what you say or what you do. But the key there is like thinking through like some key ways where you can understand the language. Venture Deals is both a book and a course the book isn't free, but the course is. Online, multiple weeks. Venture Deals is a way that you can definitively figure out how venture capitalists speak. That's the tagline of the book: how to make yourself smarter than a venture capitalist or smarter than a lawyer. How to start a startup is another one. Free online course, really focused on how people can start a startup and get very comfortable with the vernacular, very comfortable with the language. And then on the end, there's tons of blogs and podcasts. So these are table stakes, if you will. You need to be able to understand the language that you're speaking of in order to compete. So these are some easy ways to learn that language and get familiar. The real hack is this next part. So a lot of folks will come to our events year after year, beginner events, year after year. They're still coming to the beginner events because of the next hack. Most founders fail at translating their strategy to an actual execution. And that's the biggest thing that I found as I've been in this career for the past decade or so. Although there is an imbalance in the way information is shared, what really is also a part of it is that you have to actually put the plans into play. It can't be that you're learning about it, but you never went out and had a conversation like, hey, guy, I know that you invest in companies. What would it take for you to invest in me? You've never had a cold conversation with somebody who you don't know, asking them if your company is something that they would invest in. You've never actually applied for a grant or filled out a full grant application for one of the larger grants. You've talked about it, you thought about it, but you didn't do it. And that's one of the biggest pieces that I see in the mix. Part of it is because there aren't that many access routes for people to learn information, but the other part of it is that it may or may not seem like it's a space for people who look like you, or people who are underrepresented, or people who are in a market like Detroit that doesn't have some of the resources that the coasts have. So one of the things that I often say is that everything you ever wanted is on the other side of fear. So if you get past that hurdle of thinking about it and getting scared that someone's gonna laugh at you, that you don't understand, or that you don't have enough information to get a good investment, getting past that hurdle is the biggest step that you can accomplish in all of this. The thing that I learned I was an angel investor years ago, being on this side and then being in the VC side, is that I always thought that there was this magical black box of information that everyone else had but me. And that is not true. It's really about getting out there and being immersed in the ecosystem. And the way you do that is hacked. Become part of the pipeline. There are thousands of people who are putting on amazing events, And there are amazing ways where you can get your basic questions answered. But you should have started that with doing some research and some reading on your own. So once you've done that, you need to become part of that ecosystem. And once you go to a beginner event, the beginner event is not complete unless you say, what do I do next? Because now you feel good, you feel like you did a little bit towards your goal, but all you really did was come and sit into information. What did you follow that up with action? That's how the ecosystem gets hacked. That's how more people get into all these programs that people are putting together, especially programs aimed at underrepresented folks. There it goes, sorry. So you don't want to be on the left side. So that's the other part. So when I talk to investors and I talk to grantors and I talk to people who are giving the money, their biggest criticism and critique of the folks that we're talking about who have applied is that they're still asking questions on the left. These are I hate the terminology, but it's the real terminology, which is the entrepreneurs. A year after they first had their idea, all they've ever done is register the LLC. A year after they had their first idea, they need an investor, but they've never done any steps to actually get the investor. They need to validate the idea, they need to understand an investment term sheet, but they never actually downloaded one from the web and started circling things they didn't understand. They never went past that first level of, hey, I got this idea and now I put it out there. The next step is what the follow-up is needed. And we work really hard to get people on the other side. So people who are like, how do I get my first customer? How do I get my first $100? How do I get my first $1,000? How do I spread? How do I expand? Because those are the things that investors are looking for to qualify you to figure out if not, you're a good fit for their investment portfolio. Those are the things that grantors are looking for to qualify you to see if you should be awarded a grant above all others. So pipeline. Pipeline is one of the most kind of misunderstood concepts that I've seen in the investment world. People talk about it all the time. When you ask most of the multi-billion-dollar investors what they do and why they don't have more minorities or more women or more people from not the coast as part of their portfolios, the first thing they usually say is, we didn't have those people in our pipeline. We didn't have those people, we didn't know any of those people to even consider, so that's why there's less people who make it through. And when I say pipeline, the pipeline is people who would be qualified, and then they have to then go find a match with an investor to figure out if they're a good fit for their portfolio. And there's a little cartoon in here, but the key is that typically that match is an Ivy League education, typically a male, typically a person of a Caucasian background. That's typically the pattern that they're looking for because that's how they made money before. And I think that one of the things is understanding that there's a lot of misinformation out here about how this works, but this is really a people-based business of convincing one person that you're a good fit. Nobody else controls their money or controls their access to their money. You have to figure out the language and the way that it works and figure out how you can hack past not being the typical fit in the pipeline, or if you are the typical fit in the pipeline, figuring out how you can get them to then have a meeting that you can then turn into an investment. This pipeline is enhanced by placing people on the path of reality versus myths. And so there are so many people who talk about investment but have never made an investment, so many people who talk about wanting an investor but who have never actually even figured out what they would do with the money if they got it. And there's a lot of people who really don't understand that this is not some institutionalized government thing, it's a people sport. So really key is to note is this is all about human relations and getting people to assess you and think that you are worthy for getting a part of their portfolio. Investing is personal, it is not institutional, I mentioned that a couple times. So the biggest way that we can get in the mix is jump. Try and fail, have a conversation, see if you're a fit, ask them what they want. One investor might want a term sheet, the other investor might want nothing. So those are kind of important things. Okay. So patterns can be broken. And that's what we work really hard for with Backstage Capital and Venture Catalyst, is breaking the patterns of who is a worthy fit for an investment. We focus really hard on teaching the reality and not the myths. Backstage in and of itself invests in the LGBT community and invests in what we call the underestimated founders, who are women, people, and people of the LGBT community. Across the board, when you see that, when we talk about the pipeline, we created a new pattern and a new pipeline of investment. We had when folks were telling us there weren't that many underrepresented founders to invest in, when we opened up 24 slots for our accelerator globally, we had 1,900 applications. That's not a pipeline problem. That's an education and an access problem. And within that program, our goal was changing how and where they recruited, how and where people were gaining intros, how they were valuing people's experience, how they were valuing products and markets that they didn't have perhaps experience in. They never had heard of some of the problems that some of our entrepreneurs were solving, but that didn't mean they weren't investable. That just meant they were out of their sphere of knowledge. So we're tapping the pipeline and we're making it bigger. I'm making this available to everyone. I always do afterwards because I usually like to share a lot of resources, but there are dozens upon dozens of groups who are doing similar work to what Backstage is doing, who are investing in underrepresented populations. But the real hack really is just figuring out how to hustle. It's going to take 1,000 intros probably to get to 100 actual conversations, to get to 1 real transaction, or maybe 5 real transactions, and maybe 2 investments. It is a very tiresome process, but it takes a lot of hustle, and a lot of people underestimate what that really takes. But it can be done. This is Delane Parnell, who is a Detroit expat and a Detroit native. He just finished another $50 million round, making his total investment into his company, Play Versus, $96 million. It can be done. And obviously, he's been one of the most consistent folks I know who are practicing some of these pieces, but it can be done. You may not even want to do all that level, but it can be done. So education is the next part. And again, we won't really jump into these. These are things that you need to know. But education is not about a formal book or a college degree. It's about educating yourself and figuring out people who can be help to you along the way. I think across the board, there's just not a lot of access to how venture capital works, how investments work, and how large-scale funding competitions work. So with that, that's one of the things that we've been working on with Venture Catalysts. So Venture Catalyst is the ecosystem development group. We focus on large-scale ecosystem development that enables all populations, and especially those in Detroit, to have access, to figure out ways to learn more, to get more funding, to get more top-level executive education. Across the board, when we're looking at ecosystem development, there are tons of programs, as I mentioned, that are looking at how do we help entrepreneurs. All of these programs offer some funding in one way or another. And what's key is that they are developed by folks who most of the time can't get the responses that they need from the crowd in order to make it worth the while of the funders that they've already got attached. And that's really, really important that we are participating when we're saying we want to do this, let's actually follow through and do it. As I mentioned, many of them are free and geared towards entrepreneurs. So this is the biggest thing I need you guys to take away. Funding does not equal success. People think that. They think if I get the funding, that means I'm good. Funding is just a tool. Funding is just one of the ways that you can use to solve some of those problems that we talked about in the first part. All those problems of how the team works and how the product works and how your marketing works. Sometimes funding can help you solve those problems. Sometimes it can't. Funding isn't going to put a Band-Aid over all the things wrong with your business. It's just going to be a tool that can help you get to the bottom. I think it's going to go. Pack 3. As I mentioned, launching and scaling is the real goal. With that, there are 14 and 20 ways that you can do venture capital that aren't venture capital specific. One of those is revenue. That's the most overlooked, of actually getting your consumers set up. Another one of those is getting, you can get loans based on your purchase orders. Another one of those is crowdfunding, which sometimes does have equity where they want a piece of your company, sometimes it doesn't. Other pieces are a lot of different ways where people are going in there and getting government grants that are sitting out there, millions of dollars that are going unclaimed each year. These are all funding sources that a lot of people do not spend any time on. Across the board, one of the easiest free tools that we talk about a lot is Google Alerts. This is how you're finding information of who got funding, who has funding that's up, who's a company similar to yours that you might be able to follow their path and talk to their founder and figure out what they did. It's about creating access and getting information and making that information equal. So one of the things that I would say is joining a dedicated program. I might know a dedicated program that might be pretty good. Backstage was in Detroit, London, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia. It was an amazing program over 3 weeks, putting master classes and access to entrepreneurs and investors and large-scale developers to a cohort of 24 people across 4 cities globally. There are tons of programs like that, happen to be kind of partial to this one. And the last part is aligning among proven business models. It's so simple. There are retail businesses, social entrepreneurship businesses, tech businesses, and all sorts of hybrid models. So figuring out who you know, going on LinkedIn, in this room right now, figuring out who might be doing something similar to you, and figuring out what they do best, what they do worst, what they study, and what they admire, that's an easy hack, because that means you don't have to go through the same trouble that they did to get their funding. So networking, that's the biggest hack of all. I cannot stress enough how important relationships are. There's no secret sauce. There's no, oh, here's this one thing that's going to make it all fall together. It's really a lot of work. It's a lot of work of pulling in relationships and making people believe in you. So as I mentioned, there are 3 numbers. The first number is 1. I'm challenging the audience to spend either an hour a day, or if that's too much, an hour a week, focusing on how you're going to get funding for your program or how you're going to help someone else get funding who you're invested in. I'm making you aware that Backstage, in particular, is starting free office hours in October. There will be 10 office hour slots open a month. There are at least a half dozen other programs I know who are doing similar things. You can come in with your documents, with your ideas, with your questions, and get feedback from blooded people who have been doing this for a long time. And the third number is 30,000. That's how many people have been through Venture Catalyst programs. And that doesn't even touch the number of people who've been touched and written to us for Backstage Capital programs worldwide. But just in Detroit, there's been 30,000 people go through our programs, which most of them are free. So if they can get that information and ask what the next step is, you can as well. So how do you start? Just like this. Try something that scares you new every single day. And that's all I have.